And we are back. It is, what is this, week 10 we're heading into? We are officially well past the halfway point. Brady, how did week 9 treat you? We had almost all of the chalk bust in the sense of the top players. Like, James Conner didn't have a good game because his team inexplicably didn't kill Dallas. It was Justin Jackson gets hurt on, I saw it was, I believe, maybe an RPO or a pass blocking situation because he didn't record a touch and still got hurt, which is incredible and incredibly devastating for my lineups. Like Tyler Lockett, despite playing in a great game, didn't really do much. How did week 9 treat you?
It actually had probably the best week of my life in week 9, and it was crazy. I was winning a ton of money all throughout the day, and I was looking really good. I was looking to make some serious cash. I had Edmonds, I had Connor, and I had Justin Jackson going to later games. They didn't end up doing so good, but still, my best lineup was a Drew Locke Broncos stack. Drew Locke was really low owned. He scored like 33 points. Evan Ingram did really well. It was cheap tight end. And I had a Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook in the same lineup, and both those guys almost combined for 100 points right there. And I got a little gift. McCaffrey was only 4% owned for me, so really good week. Hopefully bringing it to week 10 here. I can't believe we're already at week 10. That's crazy.
I know, it is flying, and every week presents so many different obstacles, I guess, with like certain players maybe not even playing just because they came into contact with the wrong person, licked the wrong pole or whatever. So well, some of that. I think Ben Roethlisberger is the only guy this week who has that potential, and it seems like he's the Matt Stafford, few practices missed and fine. So let's get into it. We have first game on my list is Giants versus Eagles. It is a 44.5 point total, which is climbing, but it's still quite on the low end, especially in the context of now we have so many good games on any single week because of the scoring. This game to me is palatable for one-offs. I think Miles Sanders getting, the bulk of both the pass catching work and the running work. If he plays this week, I know he returned to practice. Doesn't guarantee that he played, or that he will play, but it seems at least more likely than not. I think he's fine. I think Dallas Goedert at 4,200 is actually a good pivot off of someone like Austin Hooper, who I have projected as fairly chalky. But I think that's all this game is maybe some one-offs, some pivots. Do you have any interest in stacking this game? And if you're playing any of the Eagles, who'd you run it back with on the other side? Because the other side seems much more ambiguous to me.
No, this is probably just one-offs for me as well. A low-scoring game it looks like it's going to be. Not all that interested. You mentioned him, Miles Sanders, 6,400, coming back from an injury, averaging 16.9 points. Whenever he's healthy, really good player, can catch the ball as well. Alshon Jeffrey might be coming back. If he does, it will be his first game of the season. He is at 4,000 on DraftKings. I think that could definitely be interesting against this Giants defense. Other than that, on the Giants side, it's really hard to be excited about one player. Probably not going to play anything there. So really for me, I'm just looking at Jeffrey, maybe some Sanders, maybe even the Eagles defense at 3,600 as well.
Yeah, it's a game. Eagles defense, I think it's fine because Daniel Jones isn't very good. You could go with the running back defense correlation there, but generally I think that's something I'm not even too keen on because, like, if a defense has a good game, it's probably because they scored, and that's a drive that they essentially steal from their running back. So I don't think it's negatively correlated. I just think the correlation is soft and may have some sort of upside capping ability. I'm fine moving on. The next game is actually a game that will have probably a decent amount of popular plays, at least a few. We have the Browns versus the Texans. Browns are a field goal favorite right now. This total is actually plummeting. I mean, 49 is still good, but it opened at 54. So what do you make of this total coming down, and does that have you hesitant at playing this game at all, given that, the Browns are a run-first team, the Texans are the underdogs, and I believe they're on the road here. What do you make of this game environment as a whole?
I kind of don't really understand why that total is coming down. I mean, both defenses are not great, especially the Houston defense, and I always kind of trash the Browns passing defense as well. And in this game, I actually have a lot of interest. I'm curious to see the ownership on some of these guys, but I really like Deshaun Watson at 6,900. You're getting a nice price savings off of the top guys. Murray's like 8,000. Josh Allen's like 7,500. Watson's been fantastic as of late, and I love the stackable options as well, especially against this Cleveland secondary. Will Fuller, 6,700. I like a lot. I think he has a lot of upside. Brandon Cooks at 5,600. Played him last week. He had like a really good first drive. After that, he kind of, didn't really do much for the rest of the game, but still he had 9 targets, 3 receptions, had a touchdown, like 18 points. I think Brandon Cooks is way too cheap. So in the last 4 weeks, Brandon Cooks is actually getting more targets than Will Fuller, who is, over 1,000 more than him. So I really like Brandon Cooks. I think that, is David Johnson might not play this week. If David Johnson does not play, I believe he's in concussion protocol, something like that. But if he does not play, Duke Johnson at 5,000, pass catching upside against a Cleveland defense I'm not all that high on. I like And the Browns is kind of tricky. I'm not overly excited about any of these wide receivers, any of the tight ends. They have like 3 different tight ends. It's hard to pick which one's going to do what. But I think if Chubb comes back, I'm probably going to stay away from the backfield. Maybe in tournaments and something you look at. But if Chubb is out, I'm probably going to go back to Kareem Hunt. But we have to look for that news later in the week.
Yeah, I think like a few updates. One, like they said, Chubb, it was like the least helpful piece of news I've ever heard. They said there was a chance that he plays this week and they would know by Friday. Well, just talk to me Friday then. I don't care. So we just don't know with Chubb. You can catch Brady on the Sunday morning show and find out if Nick Chubb is playing or not. So check that out. On the Houston side, yeah, it hasn't even been. It's not like it's one spike game from Brandon Cooks. I believe in 3 of the past 4, he has out-targeted Will Fuller. Despite that, what is he, 1,100? That is cheaper than Will Fuller. I think Brandon Cooks quietly operating, maybe not as the number 1 receiver. Maybe you could argue it's just a small sample, which it is, but at least the 1B, I think, is almost for sure. And he has that upside of being, the number 1 target for Deshaun Watson. So I think he's an interesting play. I'd take him over Will Fuller if I'm playing one-offs of this game. I think this game is fine to stack. My only problem is you kind of laid it out. I don't really want to play any of the Browns tight ends, especially if Austin Hooper is going to be chalk, which it looks like he is. I don't want to play him. I still think Harrison Bryant is involved enough that Hooper is more of a leading committee tight end than he is like a Hunter Henry number 1 tight end. For that reason, Hooper just meh. The backfield could end up being really tricky. You could go to a Jarvis Landry or a Higgins, but I think for me, because the Browns side of this is so ambiguous, I'm not too excited to stack this game. It's another game of one-offs, although I am more excited about the Houston side as far as the one-offs go relative to anybody in the Giants-Eagles game. So Will Fuller, I love. Duke Johnson, I think they really have no backups who are going to take work away from him. Last week, they did not have a backup outside of Duke Johnson record a touch, I believe. Got 16 carries, 4 catches. We're going to get 3 down Duke Johnson for a week because we had David Johnson in concussion protocol, as you said, did not practice Wednesday. Does not bode well for his odds of playing. So I think Duke Johnson at 5K would be the chalk free square running back if it weren't for someone we'll get to later in the slate. So let's inch towards that. Right now we have the next game up, Green Bay versus Jacksonville. Another total that is falling. I think we've seen this in a few weeks in a row, where some of the higher total games just naturally come down a little bit because I think Vegas is trying to adjust or find their footing with these new like super high scoring games. Green Bay, massive 13-point favorites. This game is interesting because we've got Davonte Adams at 9K, projecting to still, despite his price, be very chalky, and deservedly so. He would be on pace for, I think, like 1,800 yards and like 20-plus touchdowns if he were to be playing the full season. He's not going to because he missed some games in the middle of the year, but he is on truly record-setting pace for a fantasy receiver or just receiver in general because his market share numbers are great, his quarterback is great, the offense is awesome. Then you have Aaron Jones, who I think is slightly just off in pricing at 7,100. He seems like a guy who could be pushing up at 8K, given his touchdown potential and his reasonable, pseudo 3-down role. Jamal Williams works in a little bit, but I don't think it's enough to really, be afraid of this 7.1 price. Aaron Rodgers, expensive, but also just like Davonte Adams, deservedly so. What do you make of the Packers team where I understand wanting to play their players? They have a 31.5 implied team total. I believe that leads the slate. I just think when you look at someone like doing the Davonte Adams, Aaron Rodgers stack is so wildly expensive that how do you fit in other good plays? And those plays are going to be owned.
No, you're right. I mean, that is really expensive. Rodgers at 7,900, the second most expensive quarterback on the slate. I will say this. I love Aaron Jones this week against this Jacksonville run defense that is really, really bad. You mentioned it. He should be probably priced up a little bit higher to like that 8K range. So Jones is somebody I'm looking at. Davonte Adams, he's 9,000. He's going to be chalky, but for an absolute good reason. The dude is a monster. 8 touchdowns on the year. I think he's played 5 full games. Gets a ton of targets every single week. A couple of weeks ago, he had 16 targets. He definitely has that upside every single week to get a massive amount of targets. I love the matchup here. Pretty good game total. I'm going to have Adams. I'm probably going to go there in cash. In my lineups, I'm kind of messing around with it. I was going to be paying down at tight end, paying down at running back. There's a lot of value at running back, so I do expect to pay up to get Davonte Adams. I think he's a very safe play. I think the floor is really good. I think the ceiling is fantastic as well. I'm not overly interested in a Rodgers-Adams stack. Maybe Rodgers, Adams, Scantling is somebody that's really cheap. Your dude Scantling, he finally got it done last week. 2 touchdowns on two receptions. So there you go. Hopefully you had some of there. You seem to mention him. He finally got it together. So maybe you can keep that going. And on the Jacksonville Jaguars side, I mean, I'm not really interested in anybody besides James Robinson. 6,600 against a really poor Packers run defense. Had 25 touches last week, no receptions, but the weeks before that, he's getting receptions, 4, 5 receptions. So I do think the receptions upside is there, especially if they're trailing. So I think Robinson at 6,600 is really interesting as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think much like the Houston game. Oh, no, it wasn't. Well, actually, Houston kept it close too, but it was actually the game before that where they played the Chargers. And the only reason they hung around with the Chargers is because James Robinson had a multi-touchdown game, and that kept your Herbert stacks throwing until the fourth quarter. I mean, do I think they really are that competitive in this game? No, but do I think if James Robinson scores twice, do they probably cover the spread? I don't know. It would seem likely because they're not even projected to score 3 times. So I think James Robinson is a unique, like sneaky stacking option. My only problem is that even though he does catch a decent amount of passes, he still wouldn't obviously be the primary pass catcher. So you would be a little concerned of just getting 4 or 5 receptions and not scoring. At that point, you're probably drawing dead. So I don't love the James Robinson run back, but I won't be completely unexposed to it. I think one other play you could go to is DJ Chark. Right now, Laviska Shenault dealing with a lower body injury. It might be like a hamstring or something like that. If he doesn't play, we can see a lot of volume for DJ Chark and potentially Keelan Cole, although I don't think I'd really be going that deep. So I think DJ Chark as the field stretching option for a quarterback in Jake Luton, who, for all his faults, wasn't highly drafted, didn't have much acclaim coming out of Oregon State, looked serviceable. And that's really all you need is like Terry McLaurin is kind of the proof of concept of this. If you just have a serviceable quarterback and you are getting as much volume as Chark could potentially get, which is like in that McLaurin range, you will have big weeks. They will come. So I think because he is in that role without Laviska Shenault, where there could be no real secondary receiving threat, DJ Chark would make the most sense as the run back to your Green Bay stacks. One last note, Allen Lazard, I don't believe played last week, but should be able to return this week. It's tentative, but if he does play, I'd probably lose most of my interest for Marquez Valdes-Scantling. Robert Tanyan, I'd rather play the secondary receivers in this game because Robert Tanyan coming in as in that similar like top 5 price range, but he is just a deep ancillary piece in this point. I think early in the season he was catching a lot of touchdowns. That appears to be almost exclusively variance. I would rather play more air yards in Marquez Valdes-Scantling or more efficiency in a guy like Allen Lazard, who is top 5 in a tiny sample because he hasn't played much this season. Yards per target, yards per route run, and yards per reception. He's like the efficient version of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He's what I always wanted Scantling to be, and Scantling was briefly for that one Thursday night game where I did have some, so I made some money on that. But yeah, I'd be interested in Lazard, Rodgers, Adams stacks if I was going there. But man, Adams is expensive. I think he's a guy who, if you're looking to make a bold fade, he would be the guy. How do you feel about that? And then we can move on.
I mean, I'm personally not going to do it, but I can definitely see why, especially if he's going to be high owned. I could definitely see, fading him, but man, it's really hard to fade someone that, he does it every single week.
Yeah, it is difficult. I'm not set on this, but I do think that because of his price, even if he goes out and puts up 30, it doesn't lock him into like a tournament winning lineup. There will be different ways to construct successful rosters. And if you bust at his price, he just annihilates your lineup. So does his odds look great at busting? Certainly not. He's probably the most used receiver in the league. He looks like Michael Thomas with more air yards, honestly, like 2019 Michael Thomas. So it's going to be difficult to get off. I might try though. Next game, Detroit versus Washington. I don't know. I don't care. To play Washington if you want, but man, Alex Smith looks not good. Like he is still like his yards per attempt isn't great. He's throwing interceptions at a 6% rate. He is turning the ball over, at least just in terms of interceptions, at like a crazy. He's getting sacked at a 14% rate. The interceptions at a 6% rate. Throwing touchdowns like a 2% rate. He just doesn't look that good. I don't know. It's difficult because I think it's awesome that he's able to come back and play. I don't think it's awesome that he's not very efficient. You can play Terry McLaurin. You can always play Terry McLaurin, in fact, because his volume is so good that it just does not matter who his quarterback is. Like, I could be his quarterback, and he'll find a way to break a long one. So, versus a terrible Lions secondary, I think he's a very solid one-off. I know on the other side, he would correlate maybe well with DeAndre Swift if, this Lions team does manage to pull off the victory, which, they're 3.5 favorites. So, I think that's fine. There's an interesting correlation. It kind of falls into that tier of Giants versus Eagles, where there are certainly viable plays on both sides. I don't think this is a game you just completely X out, but I probably am not playing either quarterback really.
Yeah, I'm definitely not playing either quarterback, but actually kind of have some interest in this game. It's going to be, going to have to look closely. Gibson's questionable. If Gibson does not play, I think McKissick at 4,900 would be a really good play. He played like 84% of the snaps last week, 3 carries, 17 yards, 14 targets. which is amazing, especially at 4,900. If he's going to be out there and getting that many targets at 4,900, I'm definitely have some interest. But I don't know if Gibson's going to play or not, so look out for that. McLaurin, you mentioned him, 6,800. I don't really love the price. I don't really love his quarterback, but he seems to get it done every week, averaging 18.3 DraftKings points. Really hard to stack him. It's really hard to play Smith there. On the Lions side of things, I think Hawkinson is really interesting at 5,100. He's been pretty good as of late. 14.9 DraftKings points last week, 13.5 before that, 16 for that. He's been fairly consistent this year with 5 touchdowns. The price is pretty cheap there. Have to look out for it, but if Galladay does not play again, Danny Amendola was really good last week, and he was actually really low owned. I wasn't expecting him to be like 2% owned. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 14.9 DraftKings points. That's really all you could ask for at 3,700 he was last week. He's 3,900 this week. So if Galladay is out, I think Amendola is a really good option. Gets a ton of targets, especially for his price, so that's something to look out for. Other than that, I think a defense that's interesting, I guess, is the Lions defense. I know they're not that great, but I don't think Alex Smith and Washington's all that great themselves.
Oh yeah, I never talk about defense because it's usually just the last position I fill out to do whatever you want with.
Yeah.
But like this Lions defense, they're like I think pretty solidly mispriced, and I don't even have them as the highest owned defense by a wide margin. The way Alex Smith is playing right now, I love me some Lions defense. So don't normally come with defensive takes because it's largely a random position that I just fill in with whomever. But this is a spot I actually like. So moving on, I think we've kind of sped through some games so far. I don't think I've talked about seriously stacking any one of these games yet. We're at my first stacking spot. I have a few stacking spots this week. Carolina versus Tampa Bay will be one of them. Tampa Bay, 5-point favorites. I get it. The defense is in this both sides of the ball. Like Tampa Bay has had both a great running and passing defense. Carolina, for their run defense faults, has actually had a pretty solid secondary, especially relative to the expectations. I think the expectations heading into the year was that they could be the worst secondary in the league. They played okay, and especially it could be because teams can run on them. But I think, all things considered, they're playing all right. I don't care. I do not care about defense when you have maybe one of the best ever receiving groups in Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and Antonio Brown. I think you could very solidly put an argument that this is the best trio of receivers to ever be played on an NFL field. And they're probably going to be fairly reasonably owned in terms of low ownership because we saw them come out and just get trounced by the New Orleans Saints. I'm not seeing top 5 or 10 ownership on either three of these guys. You're telling me I can get Chris Godwin in the 6K ballpark? I can get Antonio Brown for even less? And Godwin, every single route except for one on all of Tom Brady's dropbacks. Mike Evans, I believe he took a play or two off after taking a football to the groinal region, played on, or at least ran routes on 40 of 44 dropbacks. And even Antonio Brown was well above 30. So I think they have a very solidified top trio, and it's one of the best trios ever. I think the total, sitting at 50.5, will quietly be one of the least targeted totals of the slate. And on the other side, there's talent galore. And obviously, I think maybe this is where we kick it off. Give me your thoughts, one, on, what do you do with these Tampa Bay receivers? I think you can, maybe not in the same lineup, but you can play any of the top 3. But are we just jamming in Mike Davis at 4K? DraftKings, I don't know. You could argue that they didn't, he was a backup and they didn't have any reason to price him up before, Sunday afternoon or evening, whenever pricing came out. But man, 4K for Mike Davis is just a miserable proposition where I have to think about, do I play a guy who's 45, 50% owned?
Yeah, I mean, in cash, you just got to really plug him in. I don't know what DraftKings was thinking there. Even if McCaffrey was still playing, why price down Mike Davis to 4,000 minimum price there? So since McCaffrey is doubtful, not expected to play there, I think he has some type of shoulder injury. Mike Davis, he's going to be my cash lineup 100%. I think tournaments is fine as well due to this pass catching upside. And Tampa Bay has probably the best run defense in the league, but Mike Davis still can do stuff through the air. He had 8 receptions the last time they played earlier in the year. So Mike Davis, just with the reception upside alone, at 4,000, you really need only a couple catches, and he's definitely going to get those. Maybe he finds the end zone as well. It's going to be extremely chalky, though, so if you want to get away in tournaments, don't hate that whatsoever. But I think in cash, it's pretty much a must-have. And the Tampa Bay side is really interesting because they had a really bad game last week, and everybody saw that game. And, Tom Brady had 5 DraftKings points. He did awful. Everybody did awful on the Tampa Bay side. And I think a lot of people are going to look at that. It's going to be really low owned. And you mentioned it, probably the best wide receiver trio we have ever seen. And it's going to be so easy to stack this because they're so priced down. Was it because of their bad game? Maybe. Mike Evans, 6,300. Godwin, 6,000. Brown, 5,800. It's going to be so easy to stack this game. Even Tom Brady, like 6,300. And the run back options are great. Robbie Anderson, DJ Moore, they're cheap as well. So, man, I like it. It's going to be low owned. Give me some, Tom Brady, Godwin, Brown, Mike Evans stacks here.
Yeah, I love it all. I think this game is just, in terms of the total, is up there for the highest. It's not quite at the level of some other ones we'll see, but it is over 50, and it's rising right now. The options in this game in terms of the talent are incredible, and luckily I don't think, especially like on the Carolina side, we've seen some Curtis Samuel recently. I do think that is probably like an over expectation. He scored a rushing touchdown, I think 3 straight games go along with the receiving touchdown. It's not to the level of like the Justin Herbert receivers where like Gabe Neighbors or whatever, the fullback, I think, catches 2 touchdowns on 6 targets. But Samuels is running hot. I still think we have a very solidified top duo of a top 10 target share and a top 10 air yard share, Robbie Anderson. DJ Moore running the deep routes, not getting quite as many targets, but still clear the number 2. I think there's just so many good plays in this game, and they do correlate to like the very top, like 3 receivers on one side, 2 receivers on other, 1 running back and Mike Davis, and I'm not playing any of these Tampa Bay running backs. So I think it's quite obvious the spots you want to go to, and you can play, even if you just play it as one-offs. I love getting correlation with my Mike Davis chalk because I'm probably going to have a decent amount of Mike Davis. He's a great play, and I'm not saying you shouldn't fade him. At least in cash, you definitely shouldn't fade him. But you have to think long and hard about what has to happen for 4K Mike Davis to really kill your lineup. It's like a 6 or less point game. Like even 8 points is 2x, which is palatable, and it lets you spend to maybe better plays up top. That being said, because I'm playing such a chalky play, I am going to look for correlation in every spot I can get it, whether that be stacking him with the Teddy Bridgewater because he has pass catching upside, whether that be playing him as just a one-off plus Chris Godwin, who's my favorite of the Tampa Bay receivers. I don't think you can really go wrong with any of them. I'm just looking to correlate my chalk in a way that I don't think the field is going to do so. It seems like either of Teddy Bridgewater or running it back with, a Chris Godwin would be the way to do so. I mentioned him earlier. We've got him back. Justin Herbert, the Los Angeles Chargers versus Miami. Miami 2.5-point favorites at home. Total sits at 48 right now. I mean, Justin Herbert continues to just be on fire, and it has largely been the benefit of Keenan Allen, at least in terms of the volume. Taking out the one game, I believe, week 5 versus New Orleans when he left with back spasms, still scored a touchdown in that game. We have seen 12.7 targets per game, over 9 receptions, and nearly 100 yards per game out of Keenan Allen. 7,100, I believe. Is there any reason to get off of like Keenan Allen as just discount Davonte Adams?
No, so it's quite funny. Like I play Keenan Allen in cash every single week, and it works out absolutely every single week. The dude gets a ton of targets. I still and they keep pricing him up a little bit. I still think he's too cheap. Like the dude's averaging almost 13 targets when he's healthy, when he's on the field. And Herbert's been looking amazing. I mean, I think he's making a case for Rookie of the Year here, 6,600 on DraftKings. I think that's too cheap as well. Really good matchup here against Miami. I actually don't hate some Herbert Allen stacks here. The problem is going to be running it back. Like on the Miami side, like there's really not much. That's going to be the hard part. I guess what's interesting is on the Charger side, Justin Jackson, he's questionable. If he doesn't play, somebody, Ballage, I think that's how you pronounce it, Kellen Ballage, he went back to the practice squad this week. If Jackson's out, I'm assuming they're going to call back up Ballage, and he had 15 attempts. He did have a touchdown, 3 targets as well, 2 receptions. Very weird there because you'd expect Kelly to be that next guy, but it looked like it was Ballage there. So really have to pay attention to the Chargers backfield, pay attention to see if Justin Jackson does play. If Justin Jackson does play, 4,700, probably going to go right back to him. It's just a shame getting injured on like the first play. That definitely sucks. I definitely had a decent amount, but this game is very interesting, but mostly from the Charger side for me.
Yeah, so that would be. I don't. You might not be a dynasty player because if you were, you would know that's Kalen Ballage, terrible, truly disgusting running back from originally the Miami Dolphins. He got released by Miami, signed by the Jets, released by the Jets, and signed on the Chargers practice squad. Then called up when they lost Troymaine Pope, who is I guess he's their 4th running back. Without Austin Eckler, he's their 3rd. both Balaj and Troy Maine Pope have run ahead of Kelly in consecutive weeks. So if we don't get Jackson and we don't get Pope, it would probably be Balaj. If no Jackson but Pope is active, I would imagine Pope ends up being the number one back. If that's the case, I can't guarantee that Kelly does get pseudo benched for a third week in a row, but it would seem likely. So I would say maybe you could get cheeky with some Troy Maine Pope. I'd rather still just look to my Mike Williams, who is top 10 in deep targets among wide receivers. I'd rather look to Hunter Henry, who I believe has seen at least 7 targets in 6 of 8 games. He's seen, I think, at least 4 targets in every game. Just hasn't had the explosive week because random players that I don't want to hear about, like Jalen Guyton and Gabe Neighbors and Nayers, I don't know, they're fullback, and Joe Reed for a rushing touchdown, and Donald Parham, who I like, all keep scoring. And eventually, I think that just has to fall in line with the actual volume, which goes to Hunter Henry, Mike Williams, and Keenan Allen. So I'm going to keep playing Hunter Henry. Until the day I die, or he stops getting targets. If he stops getting targets, then I can get off of him. But until he doesn't get targeted, I keep playing him because Justin Herbert just looks so good. On the other side, don't have a ton of interest, but we will be without Preston Williams this week, who is on IR. I think a foot injury, got carted off. So that opens up potentially some volume for a cheap Jakeem Grant. I honestly think I'd rather just look to exclusively run it back with Devontae Parker if I'm doing any Charger stacks. Really the only guy who I can have any faith in at this point now that Mike Gesicki is kind of like this ill-used committee tight end or something. So Devontae Parker, frankly, the only Dolphins guy I have interest in. But I think because they have such a lacking receiving room and tight end room, he could actually see a lot of volume. Do you have any interest in the run back of Devontae Parker?
Yeah, I think he's all right, especially at 5,000. You mentioned him, Grant, at 3,000. If you want to really dumpster dive in and go down there and get him, I think it's fine. Just not overly excited about this, Dolphins passing game, honestly.
Yeah, it's not great. I think Parker, just because we know he has a role, is the only guy I would look at, and I'm probably only looking to him to correlate my Justin Herbert stacks. I don't really have any interest in him as a one-off, but in most, if not all of my stacks, I am looking to run it back. So I think that's been, the numbers bear it out. It's got a good correlation, helps you in tournaments. So I'm pretty much always running it back. The next game, I think this will be the most popular game of the slate. I don't know if it will be my most popular game of the slate in terms of the lineups I am building. It is Arizona versus Buffalo. Undoubtedly the most exciting quarterback matchup we will have this week and probably for many weeks going forward, because it is 2 of the, let's say, 4 or 5 best quarterbacks in the league right now. Both offer an incredible amount of equity with their legs, specifically Kyler, a threat for the 100-yard bonus. Josh Allen, I believe, 4 rushing touchdowns, a 56-point total, and only a modest spread, so it should be a back-and-forth affair, a 2-point spread. What do you make of both of these teams who are, in some ways, mirror reflections of each other? Rushing quarterbacks, defenses that I don't think are anything special, especially Buffalo being kind of disappointing. Very clear, slightly expensive, but very clear top alpha receivers, then some ancillary pieces. Where are you looking at to, 1, just play the plays in this game, and 2, how do you get different? Because I think we're going to see a lot of chalk here.
No, you're right. This is probably going to be the most popular game on the slate. It has the highest total by probably a decent margin here. It's really hard not to mention Kyler Murray, the most expensive quarterback on the slate at 8,000. Just for his rushing yard upside alone, 106 rushing yards last week on 11 attempts. The week before that, 2 weeks before that, Seattle, 14 rushing attempts, 10 rushing attempts against Dallas, 9 against the Jets there. You really can't complain going up there and getting a Kyler Murray. Great stackable options with him as well. DeAndre Hopkins, who I pretty much talk about every single week. I'm really interested, going right back to Josh Allen. Did it last week. Went fantastic. 39 DraftKings points. He did have 4 total touchdowns. Decently owned. He was 20% in my single, which is actually kind of high on there. But yeah, Allen looked fantastic. He was on a little skid there for a second. He looked really bad, but he did bounce back. The matchup was great last week. I think the matchup is great here, again, against the Arizona defense. Great stackable options. Diggs, 7,500, I like a lot. John Brown is someone who, was on a skid himself, but last week he did have 11 targets. Before that, he had 2 targets, 4 targets, 5 targets. It looks like he's getting a little bit healthier as of late, so that definitely could help him there at 5,300. On the Arizona side, of course, you have Murray there. Chase Edmonds is very, very interesting. And I don't know if Drake's going to play or not. Drake is questionable. If Drake is out, Chase Edmonds at 6,300 is very, very intriguing. So they did price him down at $500 here. And the thing about last week was he had 25 rushing attempts, 3 receptions, 28 total touches. The problem was he didn't do anything with it at all. Only 11.8 DraftKings points, which was a shame because I was really counting on him to probably take down a tournament if he did any better than that. But no touchdowns for him. Kyler Murray is a touchdown thief, and it's going to probably always be like that. But I'm going to probably go back to Edmonds if Drake is not playing there.
Yeah, so I believe we saw Drake return to practice on today, but that doesn't guarantee that he plays. So if he doesn't play, I think Chase Edmonds would be the ultimate leverage spot where you saw the volume. I knew you read it off. We're looking at an upward total of like 30 potential touches. If he finds the end zone twice on the ground, those are touchdowns that no one else in his team, like on this team that is going to be very popular, gets to score. Even if he does it through the air, that is probably killing a lot of the DeAndre Hopkins stack. So if Drake doesn't play, which seems up in the air at this point, I will be playing a lot of Chase Edmonds at a discount and potentially at an ownership discount, given that he kind of busted everyone who played him as chalk last week. On the other side, I think you hit on my favorite play on the other side that is not the obvious plays, is John Brown. Like, he was really seemed to be like getting just destroyed by this knee injury. It was something he suffered early in the season, and he read off those target totals. He just wasn't like creating separation, wasn't getting open, wasn't getting targeted. He finally came back. 11 targets, I believe, 8 catches, 99 yards. He looks back, and he looks quite good. Like, when he's healthy, John Brown is a match made in heaven for a strong arm quarterback like Josh Allen, and he gets a lot of targets when he's healthy. So if, like, as long as, we're going to see a good game environment, a healthy John Brown, I think he would go right back to the well. So you kind of laid it out perfectly for me. Last one I'll throw to you. I don't think we've talked about in the same sort of vein where he has a number one receiver who's really going to cap the overall volume, but maybe draws coverage, or maybe the game is so good that there's a trickle-down effect. Christian Kirk. Any interest in making Kyler Murray stacks different by playing Christian Kirk, who seems to be cementing himself as the number 2 receiver quite clearly?
Yeah, Kirk's not bad, 5,700. I think it's a pretty good run back option. Probably really low owned as well. Has been playing really good as of late, getting 16 targets in the last 2 weeks. 46 DraftKings points in the last 2 weeks as well. So I think defenses are focusing on Hopkins. I mean, leaving a lot of openings for Kirk. I do think that can be the case here. So yeah, Kirk's a pretty good run back option at that price for sure.
Yeah, I think maybe my most important point I could make about this game, especially if we don't end up getting, or if we do get Drake back in the lineup, that kind of nixes Chase Edmonds for me, is that I really wouldn't consider single stacking any of these guys, because I'm assuming if you're single stacking, you're paying a good price for it. If you pay, the most expensive quarterback, one of the most expensive receivers in the Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins stack, you're also getting the most popular, I believe, in projections right now, quarterback and one of the 4 most popular receivers. And to afford that, you're also playing Mike Davis, who could be not only he'll be the most popular play of the slate. He could be the most popular play of the year. At that point, maybe you could run it back with a unique player like a John Brown, and that's how you get different. Imagine, though, if you ran it back with Stephon Diggs, you would be pigeonholed into a lineup that would almost be assuredly duplicated. So for that reason, I think you almost out of necessity to build a unique and cost-effective lineup have to double stack either side of this, because both, I can make that same argument of expensive and high owned for the Josh Allen stacks as well. So I think you have to double stack with, even a Cole Beasley, or, if you want Gabriel Davis, I guess. And on the Arizona side, I think it's kind of exclusively down to Christian Kirk for me.
Yep, makes sense for me.
Let's hop into our next game. I don't care about this game. It's Las Vegas versus Denver. It's actually drawing some ownership, and I get it. Like, Josh Jacobs should, in theory, see some work. It's a 51-point total. He's a 5-point favorite. The only play I can get too excited about is Darren Waller, simply because with no Travis Kelce, no George Kittle, no Mark Andrews on the slate, he is the only premier stud tight end. His fantasy points haven't quite been in line with his volume, but I think, as long as we keep seeing the volume on an offense that certainly hasn't been inefficient, I think Derek Carr kind of gets a bad rap as a game manager. Maybe he is, but he's dang good at it. So I think Darren Waller is fine. Even eating the chalk with Darren Waller is fine. Outside of that, Josh Jacobs actually ceded a lot of work to Devontae Booker last week. I believe he led the team in rushing yards. I think that was because Josh Jacobs came into that game with an injury designation. They even called up Theo Riddick as a hedge on that. If there is any risk that, normally there is a risk that Josh Jacobs cedes pass catching work. Now there's a risk that he cedes rushing work. I feel like that is a pretty solid fade for me, just at the downside risk, knowing that I don't think his price is bad. I think he's just over 6K, but he's going to be popular. And anytime you get a player with a lot of downside risk who's going to be popular, I find those to be the easiest of fades.
No, I 100% agree. I mean, everybody loves Josh Jacobs. He seems to be popular every week. I mean, I'm not one of those
Yeah.
guys. I'm not overly high on the guy. The dude doesn't really catch passes. It looked like at the beginning of the year he might have some pass catching upside, but as of late, like not really any. So if he's going to be chalky, especially, I'm not going to play him here. I guess what I'm interested in, you mentioned him, Waller. If I was to pay up for a tight end, the dude gets a ton of targets. Definitely a key point in this offense. 5,900, but typically I do pay down at tight end. On the Denver side, it's kind of interesting. Drew Locke had himself a game last week, 48 passing attempts, 33.22 DraftKings points, which was fantastic. I did have my best lineup was a Drew Locke stack. Jerry Jeudy has been fantastic, 5,600. He did have 28 DraftKings points last week, 11 the week before that. He's looking good. Tim Patrick came back, caught a touchdown, had him last week. Noah Fant, it was very unfortunate because Fant got hurt like really, really early. He came back a little bit. He was playing injured. I think if Fant's good to go, that backup tight end, what's his last name?
Albert Okwuegbunam.
Yeah, we'll call him Mr. O there. Yeah, he's on the IR, so I think it's going to give Fant even more opportunities here in an offense where it looks like he's either the number 1 or number 2 option there. So I'm actually kind of interested in this Denver stack for a bunch of reasons. For one, it's cheap. For two, a decent run back option with Waller. And for three, I actually think it has some decent upside. Jeudy, Patrick, Fant, I think they're all some pretty good plays there. Pretty good matchup as well.
Yeah, I think the matchup is solid. I don't think, this is a defense you're really ever concerned when you're running into. My only problem would be do we think Drew Locke is good? I still don't think he's very good. I think he had, I believe the number is 313 passing yards, and that was a career high for him, and it came on the back of, I believe, 48 passing attempts. There needs to be so much volume pushing this Drew Locke Sisyphus boulder up a hill that I just, I'm not too interested in Drew Locke. I do like this game as one-offs, though. I think it's more interesting hoping that you can secure, if you can get a large spiky target share game from a Jerry Jeudy, I'm fine believing that Drew Locke is good enough to get Jerry Jeudy a large game. I just think in the context of, you need the scenario where his opponent, who has a bad defense, goes up by a massive total, and then he comes back in the fourth quarter, which I think that was totally fine to play for last week. I'm not sure we see that this week, although, I guess they are 5-point underdogs or whatever. So I think it's fine. My only concern is that maybe he gets too popular as far as last week, getting a little bit of recency bias pub. But we saw it can definitely hit, and it kind of sets up to be similar. So maybe I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth here. So I apologize to the Drew Locke fans. I mean no harm. Our next game we have is, it's fine. It's Pittsburgh -7 versus the Cincinnati Bengals. 46-point total is falling, and this is a slate where there are a lot of good totals. James Conner burned a lot of people last week. I don't feel a massive need to go back to him. I think he's fine, but he falls into sort of that Josh Jacobs tier of backs where I get it. I get there's a certain amount of volume he should see. I just think he's fine. He's you can play him if you want. I think the player I want to look to most in this game out of maybe this is in his price range. I think he's just around 5K is Diante Johnson. He has now, I believe, 4 games of double-digit targets. He's gotten injured in, I believe, all 3 of the games where he didn't hit that mark. It seems like as long as Johnson is healthy, there is going to be ample volume for him, regardless of game script, regardless of a Chase Claypool breakout. I just want to keep betting on that Diante Johnson role and the Diante Johnson volume. Any interest in Johnson? And what do you do with these Bengals guys? It seems like outside of Tyler Boyd having this consistent slot role, it's trading off weeks from, Auden Tate even, and T. Higgins and AJ Green. I just don't have any confidence that I'm going to pick the right one.
Yeah, this is just going to be a game of one-offs for me. I don't see the reason to really stack it from either side here. Not interested on the Bengals side with any of the wide receivers or anything like that. So Joe Mixon is questionable. If he plays, I guess I'll have a little bit of interest just because of how much volume the guy receives. If Mixon does not play, I think that Bernard's interesting at 5,400. I know it's really, really tough matchup. Maybe he can catch some passes, find the end zone. Just not overly excited about that. But you touched on him, Deante Johnson. We talk about him pretty much every week. When he does play, he is absolutely fantastic. He's the cheapest out of Claypool, Juju, and I honestly like him more than both guys. So, yeah, Deante Johnson is definitely going to be a nice one-off for me. Hopefully he stays healthy for the whole game. If he does, he has a ton of upside here. 10 targets last week, 14 points. He had 15 targets in Week 7. He definitely has that upside. I think he's probably the number 1 or number 2 receiver on that team there.
Yeah, I think maybe it'd be interesting to run with like a Joe Mixon, Deante Johnson lineup specifically because like I think obviously the spread is much more in favor. It's a touchdown in favor of Pittsburgh. But man, boy did Pittsburgh show us that when like Vegas can be wrong. They're our best way to measure the outcomes of games. But the error bands on any individual game are still very wide, as we saw that they were supposed to, beat the brakes out of Dallas, a Dallas team on their fourth-string quarterback. And Dallas came out and nearly won that game. I think there was like a blown call or something, supposedly a blown call that basically gave Pittsburgh the game, or at least a shot at the game. So I think anything can happen on an individual game. I will be playing some Joe Mixon because of that, assuming he plays, obviously. Because like you said, like he gets a lot of work. It's not maybe the best spot. It's a difficult defense. It's an underdog spot. But I think anything can happen if Joe Mixon is going to be incredibly low owned, just like we saw, it was like, I don't know, week 3 or 4 maybe. He still has incredible upside, like very similar to the upside of like Aaron Jones, Miles Sanders type, where they get most of the carries and most of the targets. So I think he correlates well with Diante Johnson. If his team stays competitive, Pittsburgh doesn't get to run on this lead. They actually have to throw the football. That bodes well for Diante Johnson. So Johnson, Mixon, Stacks, I think, are my favorite. I'd feel comfortable if you said you liked Claypool or Juju, who's been playing much better as of recently. I just think Johnson is the easiest way to lock in volume. Moving on, we have the New Orleans Saints 10-point favorites. And I mean, this poor San Francisco team just seems to be drawing dead because of their injuries. The total sits at 48.5 and has come down 2.5 points since opening. I mean, if we don't get Kendrick Bourne, who got put back on the COVID reserve list, I think like a Richie James punt play is in the range of outcomes, but I don't love it because I still think we would probably see Brandon Ayuk coming back. So I don't know. I think he's fine. I think Ayuk would also be fine if he plays. But my problem with this game is I have no clue. Like, I can't be confident that anyone in San Francisco is going to do well. If like, do we think Richie James repeats his performance from last Thursday? No, obviously not. Does Brandon Ayuk come in and steal work, but is it enough to make him fantasy relevant? No. So I think Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas, as is the case every single week, either of them are healthy, are totally in play. Kamara as probably, without McCaffrey in the lineup right now, the best 3-down back in the NFL. Michael Thomas will probably go underlooked. I think he's only 7,400, and we saw last season. Like, our prior should still be anchored on last season because of how little we've seen from Michael Thomas. He has just as much upside as, outside of the touchdowns maybe, Davonte Adams, or how I talk about Keenan Allen or DeAndre Hopkins. He is in those same tier of receivers if we look at last season. And I think because this game and environment isn't quite as exciting, people will overlook him. If his team does end up getting to their nearly 30 implied team total and they win by 2 touchdowns, they're going to need someone to score the points to get there. It could be Thomas. It really could only be like Thomas or Kamara outside of your Josh Hill and Jared Cook and Taysom Hill touchdowns, Adam Troutman even. So I think the most likely outcome is that if this team really goes in on San Francisco, it happens on the back of Thomas or Kamara. So I like them. Outside of that, this game is difficult for me because I don't see a ton of run back potential.
Yeah, I don't really see any run back potential as well. But yeah, I'm not really interested in anything from the San Francisco side. I think Ayuk's fine. Especially if Bourne doesn't play, if Samuel doesn't play, I think he's okay. You mentioned him, James, at 4,000 could be all right if those guys are out. I think Jordan Reed's kind of interesting at 3,500. So he only played 13 snaps last week, but the dude's probably the most talented active tight end on the roster right now. The problem is he's pretty much made out of glass, and he has been all his career. But when he's playing, he's a really good pass catcher. So I think at 3,500, I think they kind of just wanted to bring him in last week, 13 snaps. I do see that increasing. He's probably going to be like 1% owned or less than that. So I think that's something I'm looking at as kind of a sneaky, cheap tight end play there. And you mentioned him, Michael Thomas, 7,400. I'm actually really interested in this play. Came back last week, only 10 DraftKings points, 7,400. He started off the year at 9,000 in salary. And you mentioned it as well. He has the same upside as a Keenan Allen, as a Davonte Adams, and we're getting him at 7,400. We're probably getting him at lower ownership as well. So Michael Thomas, I think he does have that slate breaking potential there. So Thomas is somebody I'm going to. I think Kamara is fine. Pretty much any single week, pretty much whoever he plays with the pass catching upside. But I'm really interested in Thomas at 7,400 there.
Yeah, I love that. And I think the Jordan Reed call is sneaky because we didn't see him play a ton last week. But maybe I'd have to go back and look at the splits in his first half, second half. But there was no reason for them to play they didn't need to sustain any more injuries. Their game was over by halftime, so it would make sense that a guy who is, glass bones and paper skin shouldn't have been playing in a lost game anyways. So maybe he comes back and plays like that week 2 role where I think Shanahan heading into, it was either week 2 or 3, said that they didn't want to use Jordan Reed for more than like 20 snaps. He played nearly every snap and scored twice and looked like old school Jordan Reed too. It's just, can he stay healthy? He's healthy right now, so that's the information I'm going to work with. I think he'd be the sneakiest run back you could play with, like a Michael Thomas. And I really like that. So that's something I actually have to work into my lineups a little bit more as right now. So last game on the slate. I'm glad this comes up as the last game because it's my favorite game. It is Los Angeles versus the Seattle Seahawks. LA Rams are 2-point favorites. It's a 55.5 point total. That is only half a point less than the Buffalo Arizona game. But as of the ownership projections I have looked at, this game appears to be featuring significantly less chalk than the game, the Arizona-Buffalo game, which will be the chalk of the slate. Why should we view this game any differently? Vegas says it should have almost the exact same amount of points scored. It has at least one quarterback who is right now playing as probably the best, or at least, best or second best quarterback in the entire NFL in Russell Wilson. And I get the defensive matchup is difficult, but based on, I think, passing DVOA, pass rush, top half teams in the pass rush by PFF, top half of teams in coverage by PFF. None of those metrics have had any significant impact in the splits, Russell Wilson versus the better defenses and Russell Wilson versus the worst defenses. And I think it's largely because when he plays the better defenses, even if they get the better of him, like Buffalo definitely did, or maybe he got the better of himself because he had like multiple turnovers, I think like an interception in the end zone. It wasn't a good game. He still gets there because when he doesn't play well, he is still quite good. It just means he makes some egregious mistakes. It sort of puts him into like that Jameis Winston style where he gets to pass a little more, he has more touchdown upside, and when he doesn't make mistakes, he's just on. He just kills teams. So it has been really no difference. Good defense, bad defense, doesn't matter for Russell Wilson. So for that reason, I don't care about the Rams having a good defense, which they do. And on the other side, I do care about Seattle having a terrible defense. So the two obvious pass catching options in Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods make ideal run backs. Just tell me why I shouldn't go all in on this game, specifically choosing it over Arizona versus Buffalo.
No, I 100% get it and agree with you, especially if it's going to be lower owned than that Buffalo game. And I like this game from so many perspectives. Like if you played a quarterback stack every single week against Seattle, you'd be looking pretty good outside of when Jimmy G got injured. But this Seattle defense is like really, really bad. They've given up the most points to wide receivers. They've given up the most points to quarterbacks. They're absolutely awful. And Jared Goff is interesting, averaging 19.6 DraftKings points, 6,500. I love the stacking options. Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods. I think Josh Reynolds at 3,500. I really don't get this price point. 9 targets week 8, 8 targets week 7. He's getting a decent amount of targets. So that price point at 3,500, it definitely allows you to get a nice double stack in there. And the run back options are fantastic. I mean, Tyler Lockett, 6,500, pretty cheap there. DK Metcalf, someone who has a huge ceiling. So I'm really liking the Goff stack. And on the flip side, like Russell Wilson had a awful game last week, and he still scored nearly 30 DraftKings points. So I'm not scared about the matchup at all. I can see myself stacking it from both ways. The run back options are fantastic either way. So I definitely agree with you, especially if it's going to be lower owned. Like I'm way more interested in this game here.
Yeah, so let's end with this because we've had like every other week, maybe it's like every 2 weeks, we switch between having Tyler Lockett season and DK Metcalf season. Now we have DK Metcalf priced over 7K and Lockett just, I think, in the mid 6Ks. It is a pretty big price discrepancy. The targets are nearly identical. Lockett, I believe, has 2 more targets, but DK Metcalf just racking up air yards at a rate Tyler Lockett is not. That also means Tyler Lockett, because he's so much cheaper, is going to be more highly owned. Which one of these two would you be choosing to go with? Keeping in mind that, like, I think both are perfectly fine. I am playing a lot of both, but if you had to pick one, which one are you going with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of upset about last week because I did go with Lockett last week in a lot more lineups than Metcalf. Only 8 DraftKings points. So I will say this: I think Metcalf probably has the more upside, the more touchdown upside, and all that. But Lockett's more than capable of having a really good game. Like he had a 45-point game a couple weeks ago. So if you're getting the $900 savings there, if you really want to save some salary and go with Lockett, you can. But I'm fine with paying up in $7,600 for Metcalf, especially if you're getting a cheap Josh Reynolds in your lineup. I think you can this week, and a cheap Mike Davis as well. Like roster construction is going to be easy.
Yeah, like I think the way you should be looking at at just DFS in general this week is that salary should not at any point be much of an issue. You should really be focusing on building in high correlation and building in uniqueness, because I think Mike Davis is basically too good to be faded, at least for my lineups. I think Jamal Williams, I saw a lot of the top players from like Awesemo to Brandon Adams to Brick and RBX, I believe, all played Drew Dinkmeyer, another one, all played Jamal Williams the week he was chalk. He was 4K in as the number one running back. They all played him above the field pretty significantly too. So, and like, if you're watching this and you don't know who those are, basically the players who have consistently max entered and won the Millie Maker over the past few years, just the best tournament minds that we have to look at right now. All of them deemed that the Jamal Williams chalk was just, it didn't matter. He was too good of a play. I think Mike Davis is in a very similar spot. So for my lineups, I'm looking into jack up the correlation to max out on how unique I am getting. And yeah, I'll just eat that chalk with Mike Davis. So for that, for myself, at Kyle Tweets here on Twitter, for Brady, at DFS_numbers, we will catch you guys next week.